Now, at the time, writing truly polyphonic music for solo violin was incredibly unusual, but Bach took this and transformed it into something amazing for the concert stage. The violin was generally thought of as a melodic instrument, something that sat over harmony and played single melodic lines, but Bach approached it almost like a miniature keyboard instrument. And even in passages that seem purely melodic, there are often hidden bass lines, implied harmonies, and intricate counterpoint that all unfold beneath the surface. So tonight, I'd like to perhaps explore how Bach creates the illusion of multiple voices within a single instrument, and perhaps offer a few little things to listen for as we hear the competitors perform these works tonight. So to begin, I'd like to play the opening subject from Bach's G minor fugue for you guys. I must note that there are 3 different Bach sonatas being performed tonight, but to keep things simple and to keep the demonstrations straightforward, I will be focusing on the G minor sonata, his first sonata. So you may not necessarily hear exactly what I'm going to play tonight from everyone, but the ideas and the examples should follow, and it'll be very easy to understand. Right, so the G minor sonata fugue has a subject or main idea which is only 9 notes long, very short, and it sounds a little something like this. That's it. But Bach was very complex, and he never ever wrote a simple idea on its own. So in reality, the first line of the G minor fugue ends up sounding something a little bit more like this. And I'm going to call upon the help of 2 other fellows, Archie and Mana, who are going to help demonstrate tonight. Not so simple now, is it? So what's extraordinary is that Bach eventually compresses all of these voices back into a single violin line. And throughout these sonatas, he's constantly asking the violin to suggest far more than it should realistically be capable of sustaining on its own. Now, before we even arrive at the fugue, Bach is already teaching the violin how to imply several voices at once. The opening adagio or grave movements are incredibly important for this. Although we still hear one main melodic idea in these movements, Bach is constantly suggesting harmony and bass motion beneath it. In a sense, the listener's ear will complete the harmony for us. Let's have a quick look at the opening of Bach's adagio in G minor, and I'll get these 2 to help highlight some of the harmonies that help sustain the melody beneath. So even though only 1 or 2 notes may physically sound at a time when the performer is playing it on their own, we can still hear this complete harmonic space. The violin can't sustain harmony like an organ or a piano can, so instead Bach gives us fragments, and he lets our ear naturally connect them together with the help of the violin's natural resonance and the acoustic of the room. You can often feel Bach thinking architecturally, and it's, I suppose, no surprise that he really was one of the greatest organists of his time. He really does take that organ or keyboard approach of composition to the 4 strings of the violin. Now, along with these harmonies, Bach is also implying and showing you very strong bass motion. Let's take the next little sequence of this Bach adagio, and I'll get Archie here to help highlight the structured bass that moves along the melody. So we'll try one more time. Once you isolate the bass line, it becomes incredibly hard to ignore. And I think one of the most magical things about these solo violin sonatas is that everything I've played here is meant to be played by one violinist, which you'll hear later on tonight. Suddenly, the violin starts sounding much fuller and the music becomes much louder and larger than what you might see written on paper. So even when only one line is physically present, we psychologically hear several layers operating at the same time. I often like to think of these strong bass foundations as the structural foundations of the music, where we get this melody that wanders and meanders through the bass below it. I'm going to play that same extract one more time, focusing on the grounded bass and how the melody might wander and explore before we meet again with a harmonic grounding point. Now, Bach also uses incredibly small harmonic details to create tension beneath the surface. There's actually a famous little debate hidden inside the opening of his G minor sonata. Halfway through bar 3, Bach writes an E natural, a note that suddenly cuts across the darker G minor harmony that's been established beforehand. Now, a lot of editors and historians say that this was a mistake. There's no way Bach would have implemented an E natural at the beginning of his first sonata. It was just far too jarring. I'll play it for you now. G minor. And all of a sudden, he's got this E natural that plays with a D. It suddenly sounds far too dissonant for anything that we would have seen that Bach had done beforehand. And that's why a lot of editors and academics suggested it should have been E flat, just like this. Something far more common. But a lot of academics note that Bach resolves this E natural to an E flat just a beat later. And they reckon it was purely deliberate, that there was this true sense of tension and release that Bach implemented here, which totally fits in. And I'm in no position to tell you what's right or wrong, but suggest perhaps now I'll play both for you and I'll let you decide which version you like best. That version had the E natural, and here's with the E flat, which most editors suggest nowadays. I'll leave it at that. Now, these opening movements can almost feel improvisatory at times, like someone's thinking aloud as they meander through endless webs of harmonic possibilities. There's a reason musicians outside of the classical world, particularly jazz musicians, have often felt such a strong connection to Bach. Bill Evans, the famous trumpet player, even spoke about jazz, reconnecting it with the older improvisation techniques and norms of the Baroque period in Bach. I suppose it's no surprise that Bach was one of the greatest organists of his time, but what many people don't know is he was actually just as well known for his improvisation as he was compositions. There are many stories of musicians travelling huge distances just to hear Bach sit down at the keyboard and improvise these amazing bits of music in counterpoint. There really is a true sense of searching and hesitation and final release as we hit these harmonic destinations, I feel. Now, and it reminds me of a story quite a few years ago when I was still in high school. I was performing in a wee ensemble with Mark Menzies, a very famous violinist based in Christchurch. And I remember it was the day before, maybe it was the day of the concert. He stands up and he goes, "I think I'm going to improvise a cadenza." And I was shocked. I had never seen anything like this in the classical music world before. And he was insistent. He goes, "I'm going to come up with this solo on the spot, depending on how I feel, and then I'm going to gesture to the orchestra to come back in, and we'll have a grand finish." And we were all sort of sitting there hesitantly, not sure how it was going to pan out, but I think that's just the fun of it. And of course, being the amazing musician he is, during the concert, he played this improvised cadenza, gestured to the orchestra, and we all came back in, and it was absolutely amazing. I had never felt such excitement and spontaneity within classical music, and it's really changed the way I view these pieces by Bach, there really is a sense of spontaneity and freedom that comes with these opening movements. And I can't help but think Bach was referring to his improvisation when writing these bits of music. So in this slow movement, Bach creates the illusion of several voices through resonance, harmony, and implied bass motion. But then comes the fugue, and all those hidden voices fully emerge. Unlike the opening movement, where we hear one clear melodic line moving through harmony and bass, the fugue transforms the texture completely. Bach takes a single musical idea, called the subject, and begins multiplying it. The fugue itself was already an incredibly intellectual and old tradition in music writing, even within Bach's own lifetime, but Bach transforms it into something incredibly exciting and phenomenal for the concert stage. Let's first have a listen to that same subject I played for you guys at the beginning. Just 9 simple notes. And then, in the next part, Bach takes that same melody, rewrites it a fifth down, and introduces it again on a different string, like this. But he's not done yet. He does it one more time in bar 3. So within the first line, we've got 3 different voices playing this opening subject, and it sounds a little something like this. This small idea becomes the entire foundation of the movement. And what's remarkable is that it never simply repeats mechanically. It's constantly changing its role, position, tension, and meaning throughout the fugue. The subject begins appearing in different voices and registers. One voice states the subject, when another one comes in and repeats it, and they're constantly fighting for attention. And eventually, these begin overlapping and competing all the time. This is one of the reasons fugues feel so exciting and alive. The hierarchy is constantly changing. Sometimes the subject dominates, and sometimes tiny fragments become structurally the most important. The listener's attention is always changing between lines and voices, and I think that's really important when listening tonight. In romantic music, or music before Bach, we often think of the violin as a very simple line, and that's what we've heard. But in Bach, one of the greatest challenges can simply be deciding which voice to listen to and which line is the most important at the time. And Bach also rarely ever wastes material. Even when the main subject temporarily disappears, fragments of it appear through what we call episodes, which are sections of music unrelated to the original subject. But even though the subject might not fully be present, I'll leave it up to you tonight to see if you can hear fragments and little bits that pop up from what you've heard beforehand. You'll often hear repeated rhythmic sections, similar interval patterns, sequences, and even similar voices that you've heard in previous passages. So even when the subject itself isn't fully clear, I'm sure it'll still feel connected and alive to the beginning. And just when the texture already feels impossibly dense, Bach tightens it even further. Entries begin arriving before previous statements have even finished with a technique called the stretto. Each violin, or each voice you'll hear on the violin, overlaps before the previous one has even finished, and they're constantly fighting and battling for attention. It feels like several simultaneous minds thinking alike, and somehow one violinist has to pull all of these voices off by themselves. Here's a wee example of what that might look like. Pure chaos, isn't it? But what I think is jarring here is I'm playing it quite a bit under tempo. I don't think you'll hear any performer tonight perform it as slow as I have just done. Most performers choose to play it at a speed similar to this. Now that I've separated all those voices, it's pretty clear to see just how much is going on within a single line of music. So now let's return to Bach's original solo version. You're probably expecting me to put it together and play it for you, but it's incredibly challenging, so I think I'll leave it up to the world's greatest young violinist tonight to show you how it's truly done. And for me, that's truly what makes these works so difficult. Not just technically, although they are incredibly technically demanding. The real challenge here is clarity. The performer is constantly balancing harmonic direction, phrasing, resonance, bass motion, and inner voice clarity with the general shape and musical direction of the piece, all while trying to make the piece cohesive and original to the performer. And because Bach leaves so much implied rather than explicit, different performers often prioritize different things. You've heard a lot about my own personal take tonight, but I'm sure you'll hear very different approaches from each performer. Some may prioritize dance-like characteristics and energy, whereas others might prefer to emphasize harmony and tension and release. So even within the same notes, the musical ideas and interpretations of each competitor can be vastly different, in each their own and exciting way. So as you listen tonight, I'd encourage you to listen beyond the surface melodic line. Listen for hidden bass movement, moments where voices emerge or disappear erratically, and how different performers shape the hierarchy between lines. But perhaps most importantly, I encourage you to listen for the illusion itself, because what makes these works so extraordinary is that simply Bach writes several voices at once, and he's expecting all of these voices to somehow come together within two hands and one instrument. Thank you very much, and enjoy tonight's performance.